Hi everyone, thank you for coming. I'm Hunter. I am the Visitor Experience Manager for the Swan Preserve and Eco Center. Ria Cohn and I have recently taken over planning these talks, so we're super excited to bring Joseph Wilson to you. Most people think that we protect the preserve for those larger animals that we're used to seeing, right? We protect and restore it for space so that we can take care of the elk and the sandhill cranes and all those animals that we always see. However, we also protect that native space for the bees, which are awesome. And Joseph can tell us all about them. I'd like to introduce Dr. Joseph Wilson to you. He grew up in Utah and was biologically inclined from birth. In fact, at age 2, he told his parents that he wanted to be a lion when he grew up. Although that didn't work out, he did become... Big war buzzer is going off, sorry about that. He did become a professor of biology for USU, and he is an expert on Native American bees. And he is going to tell you all about them. He is the co-author of The Bees in Your Backyard, which happens to be for sale in the gift shop, and it is like a copy. It is amazing. And so he has been invited to share his knowledge about bees all over the country. And he loves that his research enables him and his wife and his 3 kids to travel all around the country collecting and photographing the beautiful bees and wasps that live around us. That's one of my favorite parts about the book, is all of the beautiful photographs of all the bees. So without further ado, I will let him tell you all about diversity and conservation.
Awesome, thank you.
Number 6.
So the projector always makes the pictures look a little bit weird colored, but at least it's more colorful. So I'm Joseph Wilson. I'm at Utah State in Tooele. How many of you knew there was a Utah State in Tooele? Very good. I know I have one student here. You didn't raise your hand.
I didn't
know there was a Utah State in Tooele either until I got the job there. But it's actually pretty nice. We have 2 buildings. We have between 300 and 1,000 students, depending on if you count high school students that are taking in high school. We count. But anyway, so I'm happy to be here and talking about bees. I want to introduce myself. Besides the lion part, I'm interested in lots of things, mostly bugs and deserts. If I stand right here, can you guys see? Excited. So that's me down in southern Utah. I used to study nocturnal wasps. A lot of people didn't know there was nocturnal wasps. That was my PhD research. I've done a lot of work on velvet ants and butterflies, and mostly bees and deserts. I just love the deserts. The really cool fact is there's more kinds of bees in the deserts in North America than there are in the tropics. So for example, southern Utah probably has more kinds of bees than Costa Rica, which is kind of neat. So we think of the rainforest as the hotspot of biodiversity. For bees, Utah is the rainforest, right? We have more bees here in the rainforest. It's pretty interesting. I want to briefly mention velvet ants. They're my other passion. Velvet ants are not an ant, they're a wingless wasp. They have the longest stinger out of any bee, wasp, or ant. They have one of the most painful stings, I hear. I don't have them sting me. Out of any bug. They're really hard, so you can't crush them very easily. It takes 11 times more pressure to crush a velvet ant than it takes to crush a honeybee. If you're wondering why that matters, if you're a lizard and you're trying to eat one, then you have to crush it to eat it, and you can't crush a velvet ant, and then that long stinger stings you in the mouth and it hurts really bad. This is just an analysis of sting length. And this is a little video. You can see the stinger right here. Not only is it super long, but it's really agile for a sting. Like if you catch a yellow jacket, the stinger just goes in and out. But this one's like feeling around trying to sting me. And so they're cool. But I'm not going to talk about velvet ants more other than show you that they're cool. Also, there's like cool white ones down in St. George, and they're colorful and pretty. They're awesome. Oh, biggest mimicry complex in the world.
What's the name of the white one?
The white one is Dasymatilla gloriosa. Some people call it the thistledown velvet ant. I think it used to have a better name than thistledown. It looks like a little white fluffy seed blowing across the sand dunes when it crawls. People used to think it was camouflage with the seeds of creosote bush in the Mojave Desert. Some research I'm just now completing shows it's probably not camouflage. It evolved its white color millions of years before creosote bush came to North America, and it's probably white as an adaptation to keep it cooler down in the Mojave and Sonoran deserts. So, very cool. It's my favorite velvet ant because it looks really cool. Okay, we're going to talk about bees. I'm going to put this social media stuff up at the end again, so don't feel like you have to hurry write it down if you care to. This is the book that was mentioned, and I need to mention my co-author here, Olivia Carroll. She was my boss when I first started studying these 18 years ago or something. My wife introduced me, she wasn't my wife at the time, but my wife was working for Olivia down in the Grand Staircase National Monument, and I met this girl who was now my wife, and I liked her. She got me a job at the Bee Lab, and so I was Olivia's worker. I work down in the Grand Staircase now. I still work with Olivia, and we write books, and we do lots of fun things together. So, I need to mention her. And there's the book. So we also maintain sort of a blog and various social media. We're starting this year to try YouTube. It's kind of weird, but we're trying. That's why I don't really have a link to it, because they don't let you make your own link until you have like 5,000 followers or something. So my link would be just lots of numbers and digits. But anyway, we will be doing some YouTube stuff eventually. So me and Olivia care about bees, and we wanted to know across North America what other people know about bees. So we did a survey once, and we said this question: on a scale of 1 to 5, how important are bees? And as you might expect, 99% of the people said bees are very important. So that's good, that's encouraging. If you look around, there's a lot of people here on a winter evening that are coming to learn about bees. So this is an encouraging progress as far as bee conservation goes. 20 years ago, there wouldn't be a crowd like this to learn about bees. In fact, when I was out studying bees 20 years ago, people would mostly ask how often I get stung, or sometimes they would ask if I like honey. But now people ask other things, like how are the bees doing, or are the bees disappearing? So we are making progress as far as bee conservation. One of the tricky parts about that is, though, that people aren't necessarily informed about bees. On the bee talks, you have to do at least one bee pun, so I want you to be informed. That's kind of one of my goals in educating people about bees, is I want people to be informed about what a bee is. Because there's a lot of movements to help save the bees. So May 20th of last year was, the United Nations said this is World Bee Day. So there was all these save the bees kinds of things. I look online periodically, I just type in save the bees in a Google image search. These are some of my favorite ones that I found. They're nice artwork, but there's mistakes that people make because they are not quite informed. On this one on the left, I see a mistake. Save the bees, save humanity. It's a good idea. Any ideas what the mistake is?
It's a wasp.
That's a yellow jacket. So this same artist, just on a side note, that says NRDC, Natural Resources Defense Council. I put that on Twitter once, and the Natural Resources Defense Council tweeted me back and said, that's not ours. Where did you get that? It turns out it was, there's a link right there, I don't know what it says anymore, but it's a designer that was put this in his portfolio. Nice design. It's great artwork, right? It's really neat, pencil drawing and stuff. It's just not a bee. This one's also interesting. 30% of our food is pollinated by bees. Then it talks about colony collapse disorder and bees dying. The problem is, that's a yellow jacket, and corn is wind pollinated. so he's missing it in lots of ways. But so people make mistakes, and that's okay, right? We can let people make mistakes, but we want to try to inform people about it so we don't make too many mistakes. Because as we get further into this movement to save the bees, we can kind of go in the wrong direction, and then it's hard to correct that direction sometimes. So I was at a conference, as was mentioned, I have some little kids, so I go to the kid book section. This was an entomology conference, so a conference for bug geeks like me. And I saw this Exploring the World of Bees, and I opened it up to meet the bees, and I saw this big picture of a fly. So it's not just designers on the internet, it's also people that hopefully should know better. I'm not going to blame Tracy Reed because it was probably the publisher that put this picture in there. What happens a lot is you do a Google image search for bees, or you do a search on an image site that you can buy images from, and somebody has labeled that bee, but it's not a bee. And so, what is a bee anyway? A lot of people think of various kinds of bugs when they think of bees. I put all these bugs on here because only one of them is a bee, and it's that one right there. The other things are flies and wasps and things like that. So I want to spend some time this evening first talking about how do we tell what a bee is. Then I want to talk about what a bee does, because there's lots of mistakes there too. So first let's talk about bees versus flies. Hopefully you know which one the bee is, because I just circled it right here. So that is the bee and that is the fly. I don't want to spend a ton of time on here, but sometimes I spend time asking you guys what you see the differences, but I'm just going to tell you tonight. The best way for me and for my kids to tell flies apart from bees, and it works almost every time, is they look at the face. Flies have short antennas, bees have longer antennas. Flies usually have big eyes, especially these flies that look like bees. See how the eye is pretty much filling the whole half of the head? The bees' eyes are not filling the whole half of the head. They're still large eyes because they're insects, but they're not as large. So short antennae and big eyes, that is a dead giveaway that it's a fly. If you can't see the head or you can't tell if the fly, if it's big eyes and short antennas, you can also look for the skinny legs. Most flies have skinny, kind of smooth legs. A lot of bees have fat legs, like this middle leg. And a lot of bees have pollen collecting hair on their back legs. Flies don't have those pollen collecting hairs. When I give these characteristics, people often say, well, flies only have 2 wings. So I put it on here, and it's a true fact. Flies only have 2 wings, 1 on each side. Bees have 4 wings, 2 on each side. But really, when a bee is sitting on a white piece of paper and flies, you can't really count the wings very easily. When it's flying around on a flower, you can't count the wings. So it's a true statement, but I don't find it that useful when I'm trying to tell if it's a fly or not. So, you experts, you ready for a little quiz? Okay, I'm going to keep this bee here. I'm going to replace the thing over there, and you're going to tell me if it's a bee or a fly. What do you think?
Fly.
Fly, how do you know?
Short antenna. Yes.
You guys got it, and 2 wings. So this is called a drone fly. A drone is a male bee. It's called a drone fly because it looks a lot like a bee. This is one of the most common ones I see on memes or on magazine articles about bees, that bees are dying. They usually put a picture of a drone fly because they're very convincing. But they're harmless. One more quiz.
Bee.
That was a tricky one, right? That's why I think that. So you look at the legs, they look hairy, right? But look at the face. Yeah, it's big eyes and relatively short antennas. So that is a fly. It does kind of look like it has 4 wings, but they're just 2 wings folded over each other, so it's misleading. And hence why I don't usually look at the wings. I almost always just look at the face. And it usually works pretty well. One other characteristic that I didn't mention, you can't really see it very well. Bees have mandibles, so they have kind of hinged jaws, like a beetle that would pinch. Flies don't. They have different kinds of mouth parts, usually sucking or licking mouth parts. This is a robber fly. It's a predator. It will catch a grasshopper or a bee and pierce its side with its mouth and kill it, suck its guts out, basically. So it is a fly. It's just a really good mimic. So that's enough for bees and flies. What about, look at the face, that's what the arrow is for. What about bees and wasps? I think, for me, this is a lot trickier. It took me several months working in the field to finally figure out if the thing I was catching with my net was a wasp or a bee. So there are not as easy of characteristics. Flies are distant cousins of bees, so they have a lot of physical differences. Bees and wasps are really closely related, so they have a lot of physical similarities. Some of the things you might be seeing are wasps often have a skinny waist. There's a skinny waist right there. They often have thin, spindly legs, often with little spines on them. See how these are all kind of spiky legs? So they don't have pollen collecting hairs on their legs. They usually are not very hairy. You can notice that none of these wasps are that hairy. There's a couple little hairs on that yellow jacket up there, compared to the bee, which is really hairy. The skinny waist thing can be tricky though, because the bee, actually between the thorax and the abdomen, does have a skinny waist. It's just kind of chunky around that skinny waist. So here's a pop quiz. On the left, is it a wasp or a bee? It's a wasp. It has the skinny legs. It doesn't have very much hair. It looks waspy. Sometimes people say wasps look mean and bees look nice. And I agree. The wasp looks kind of mean, the bee looks kind of nice. I would have a stuffed bee on my bed like a teddy bear. I probably would not have a stuffed wasp. How about this one? Wasp. It is a wasp. It looks waspy. What about that? It looks just like the wasp, but guess what? That is a bee. So this makes it tricky. Let's just do one more with that nice. Now you're going to say bee because you are smart and you are right. This isn't a pattern. That is a bee. It looks a lot like a wasp bee. It even has that waspy looking face, kind of like I want to say Darth Vader, but I don't think he has a white mask. Somebody that looks mean like Darth Vader. That is a bee, and that is a bee. So how do you really tell the difference? The answer is it's really tricky. Under a microscope, there are some microscopic features that most of us will never see that all bees have. All bees, somewhere on their body, have branched hairs. So these are kind of like hairs that split ends, almost looks like a little feather. If you zoom in on that part of this bee, you can see there's these little branched hairs. When you zoom back out, you can kind of see it. I guess they're branched. You can actually see a couple branched hairs over here and right here. Somewhere on a bee's body will have those, even these waspy looking bees. And wasps do not have branched hairs, they just have straight hairs. Now that's not a very useful characteristic if you're trying to decide if the thing you're looking at is a bee or a wasp. So there is one useful characteristic that works a little bit more reliably, and that is they have different dietary preferences. Bees are herbivores. They eat pollen and feed their babies pollen and nectar. Wasps are carnivores. They eat meat and feed their babies meat. And I include bugs as meat. This is a katydid. This is a bee in a wasp, sorry. This is a wasp in my driveway. My wife came in once with a dead katydid and said, "This just fell out of the tree with a wasp on it. What should we do?" And we decided to put it back in the driveway and take pictures. And we did. We set it down where it was. The wasp came back and started taking little pieces of katydid, making a little ball out of it. It would fly back to its nest and give it to its babies, and then come back for more. So wasps and bees, because they have different dietary preferences, they also have different behaviors. Bees are going to spend a lot more time on flowers and doing different things because they're gathering pollen and nectar to feed their next generation. Wasps also visit flowers. They visit it for the nectar, that's their energy drink, and they visit it to find prey. They like soft-bodied things like caterpillars and grasshoppers and things like that. It also means that wasps are actually really useful. They are really good pest control for our gardens because they eat those soft-bodied things. They are also mean because they're predators. They're fun to watch because they're predators. If you think of a nature show, you don't have a nature show that often that just shows deer walking around. Usually it shows deer walking around and like a cougar chasing because that's the exciting part. So these are the cougars of the bees and wasps, and these are the sheep of the bees and wasps. I still like them. So there are some exceptions to the rules, but I'll pretend for tonight that there are not. So in that same survey, when I asked if people if bees are important, and they said yes, I then asked how many bee species do you think live in the US, and we'll talk about that later. Then I gave them this picture and said, which ones of these are bees? I want to do that tonight. Some of you might have taken this quiz before with me. So I'm going to say number 1, and you're going to say yes if you think it's a bee. You're going to say no if you think it's not a bee. Now I don't care if you know what it is, as long as you know bee or not a bee. So are you ready? It's just a yes or no question, and we'll just yell this out. Or say it gently now. Ready? Number 1.
No.
Number 2.
Yes.
Number 3.
No.
It's a butterfly. Number 4.
Yes.
Number 5.
No.
Number 6.
Yes.
Number 7.
Yes.
Number 8.
Yes.
Number 9.
No.
Because I taught you guys that one. That was a compliment. Very good. And number 10.
Yes.
It's funny because I've done this lots of times, this quiz. I've done it with my kids' 2nd grade class. I've done it in groups like this. I've done it in small little settings and big auditoriums. And it always happens the same way, other than one exception. People start off really strong and they say no, and then they say yes, and they say no, and then they get to 7. And some people that are confident will say yes, but most people just kind of say, and then number 8 they say yes, and 9 they say no, and then 10 they're again like, sure. It's hard to tell because we don't think of that as a bee, a blue bee. It's not a Cheerio, is that way? It's a green bee. So these are the bees right here. So you guys did pretty good. You actually did it. You were a very good example of how this went across the country when we did this as a survey. So most people knew honeybees, bumblebees, the sweat bee they were pretty confident with. Most people, the majority of people did not think that the green or the blue one were bees. In fact, more people thought the velvet end was a bee than the blue or the green one because they didn't come to my talk. It's probably because it's orange and black and fuzzy. But what was interesting to me is it doesn't even have wings. But that didn't seem to bother people. This is kind of weird though. When you do surveys, you kind of have to, the grain of salt thing, because who thought that grasshopper was a bee? Obviously somebody did. But that's just, so you can't just throw it out because it's a real answer. So anyway, people don't recognize green and blue bees. Surprisingly, both of these bees are pretty common in people's backyards across the US. And so why don't we think of them as bees? It's because when we have been trained through cartoons and through Honey and Cheerios boxes and through everything, that bees are yellow and black. When in fact, most bees are not yellow and black. There's a bumblebee that is, and then a lot of bees are colors other than striped and yellow and black. They're kind of metallic. So people they know bees are important, but they don't really know which insects, even in their own yards, are bees. And so that causes a kind of a disjunct if we want to save the bees. So unlike other kind of conservation campaigns to save the whales or save the pandas, we try to get people to love these animals because they're cute and they're neat and things like that. We don't need to do that with bees. People already know they're really important. What our challenge is to teach people what a bee is. Because when we want to save the bees, we usually think of these bees. These bees. So I Google save the bees, and I sometimes save things I find on Google Images so we can have a little discussion here. This is one of the many protests that people do, so that's someone pretending to spray pesticides, and these are dead bees, and it says pesticides buzz off. And so people like to think that pesticides are the cause for bee declines. And there are negative links between pesticides and bees, but there's not like a silver bullet. And I don't really have a lot to talk about that today because it's a kind of a subject all on its own. If we banned all pesticides, it's not going to save all bees because there's lots of other things that are threatening bees. So Honey Nut Cheerios had this campaign a little while ago. It's bring back the bees. They had their boxes without a bee on it. You could write in, they would send you a seed packet so you could plant flowers for bees. And then while that's a nice idea, the problem is flowers that maybe will be good for California might not be good for Texas or Florida. And in fact, a lot of the flowers that were in their seed mixes are invasive in various parts of the country. And so it's hard to do a one-size-fits-all thing because even the bees that live in Florida are not the same species that the bees that live in Utah and have different needs. And so there's an effort there, but sometimes we make mistakes with these efforts. I just like this one, it's the Save the Bees thing. Mostly I show my students this because this says, nerve poison-coated GMO corn kills bees. And that's, it's a common thing we see. We hate GMOs and we want to save the bees. There's actually no science behind that little poster right there. And it's the opposite of what the science shows. So the GMO corn does not kill bees. And in fact, there are some studies that suggest that some of these GMO crops, and regardless of what you think about the genetically modified things, because there's lots to say about it, but it often leads to less pesticide application on those crops, which is good for bees, because there's less pesticides in the margins of the fields and things. So there's no evidence, though, that the genetically modified corn kills bees. And they've tried lots of ways. They feed the pollen to the baby bees and to the adult bees, and it doesn't seem to kill them. I just saw this one today. This is a book that you can buy on Amazon. It says, Save the Bees with Natural Backyard Hives. And that seems like a good idea, but now I want to transition in this talk to this idea of saving the bees. So this is a common kind of picture we see. The skep hive is part of our state seal. It's on our, when you get pulled over by the highway patrol, you might notice that. Because it's on their car and on their patch. And there's a bee there. So this is what we think of. Save the bees with these backyard beehives. And there's been a huge increase in backyard beekeeping, which is kind of cool. People are interested in it. It's a fun hobby. You get honey. It's a nice kind of experience. But one of the problems with that is that people are, when they want to save the bees, they're often only considering this bee right here. This is a honeybee. And so we have these bee facts that are associated with this honeybee. And I have it in quotes because these are facts that people often think of when they think of bees. So the first fact, all bees live in hives, and there's queens and workers. The Bee movie with Seinfeld, what's his name? Jerry Seinfeld, who was the voice of the bee in this Bee movie cartoon, and they were honeybees and they saved the world. That's what we think of when we think of bees. We also think that all bees make honey. It's the most associated word that I get from people when I say bees, they often think of honey. And then all bees are disappearing. This is a kind of a new trend that we've seen, but it's on people's minds that bees are disappearing. So let's go through each one of these facts and talk about them a little bit. So these facts are kind of true, except for this last one. For this bee does live in hives with the queen workers. This bee does make honey, and there are a lot of threats to this bee. This is a European honeybee. But that bee is the black sheep of the bee world, meaning that it's different than other bees, right? The black sheep doesn't have to be bad, but it is different than most other bees. So let's look at each one of these kind of characteristics of honeybees and talk about it with other bees. So do all bees live in hives? Depending on our generation, cartoon bears have taught us that they live in hives, right? We always get our sidekick to get the honey out. Sometimes there's negative effects of that. And we think of these bee hives as kind of a paper-mache bag hanging from a tree with honey in it. You get your head stuck in there and it's bad, but it's also good because your head is stuck in honey and you can eat it. The problem is, that's not what bee hives look like. In fact, there are these paper-mache bags. These are wasp nests. So that's a yellow jacket. There's also bald-faced hornets that make nests like this. Sometimes people say, oh, I have honeycomb under my deck. a little kick on this. They're thinking of this. This is a paper wasp. So two different kinds of distantly related papery wasps. No bees make paper. So if you see a nest that has the papery stuff on it, it's a wasp. It's not a bee. Bees make wax. Well, honeybees make wax. This is an abandoned honeybee hive that I found out in the Mojave Desert. Honeybees like to make their hives in cavities. So in a hollow tree, like in Winnie the Pooh sometimes. In a cave, in the rocks, like in this. Sometimes they'll make it in your eaves or under your deck, but they want an enclosed cavity. And they make vertical wax combs. So the wax combs are going vertically, not horizontally like the paper wasps. But most bees don't live like that either. So where do bees live? Most of them nest in the ground. In fact, over 70% of the bees in North America are solitary ground nesting bees. So solitary, they live by themselves, and they nest in the ground in a hole that the female bee digs. So there's no hive, there's no queen, there's no honey involved. It's just a hole in the ground. So there's lots of different kind of nest architectures. Some bees make little chimneys. These are some of my favorites, and I'll show you some pictures of those in a little bit. Sometimes it's like an anthill surrounding the nest entrance. Sometimes it's just a hole in the ground that you wouldn't notice unless you saw a bee coming in and out of it. Into that hole, they bring pollen and nectar. At the bottom of the hole, they make a little room, kind of like a little nursery. I'll go back to that, don't worry. So they make a long tunnel, they make a little room. In that room, they put pollen and nectar. They lay an egg on the pollen and nectar, cover it up, and make another room. And so they'll continue this until they either hit dirt they can't dig through, or for as long as they can. And so often, one female bee will lay 8 to 15 eggs in her life, which as an adult lasts a month or so. So this is how most bees nest. I just wanted to show you this. These are some, even though these are solitary bees, when they find a patch of ground that they like, they make kind of a neighborhood there. So each one of these little chimneys is the nest entrance for different bees. You can see one comes out of this one, another one comes out or goes down into, so there's one right there. So each one of these is its own nest. They don't really interact with each other except by accident. Sometimes they'll come into the wrong hole and they'll get kicked out. We're not sure why some of these bees make chimneys. There are a couple hypotheses around it. One, it could help it so it doesn't get flooded when it rains. But these are mostly in the desert. It doesn't rain that often. And when it does, these are still going to get raindrops. It could be that it helps them find their nest entrance. But when you have this many, there was like 1,000 in this one, probably in 2 square meters down by Moab. And so that doesn't seem to make sense. What the hypothesis that makes the most sense to me is there's these parasitic flies that throw their eggs down in a bee's hole, and then that baby fly eats the stuff that was left for the bee, and it's parasite. And it probably is harder for the fly to shoot its egg down because it can't do it at an angle as if it would, when it was on the bare ground. So anyway, that's a hypothesis, but they look cool. They really like this one because it has the red and it hits some white dirt apparently, and then it hits more red dirt, so it's kind of interesting to see. So I love to watch them. So these that live here, there's some of these are red bee garden. These bees also are specialist bees, which we'll talk about later, but they have specific flowers that they go to. So these are some of my favorites. So most bees nest in the ground. Here's a picture of some of that pollen and nectar that they're leaving for their babies in 2 different styles. This one's really moist, it's almost like soup. This one's a nice sphere, like more of a pollen cake. And so different bees do this in different ways. But not all bees nest in the ground. There's a lot of bees that nest in wood. We call these cavity nesting bees, because most of them don't dig a hole in the wood or chew a hole in the wood. They find a pre-existing hole, and then they kind of alter it to fit their needs. This one is in a crack in a log in my backyard, and this one is in a hole that I drilled in my backyard. These 2 are leaf cutter bees. They cut pieces of leaves, and they use that for wallpaper inside their hole. And so instead of making little nurseries off the sides like the ground nesting bees do, they make like a long tunnel with a nursery in a linear series. They'll start very back, fill it with pollen and nectar and lay an egg, then put leaves to wall it off and do it again. So you can see right here, this is a bee larva sitting on its pollen mass. This is another bee larva, there's another bee larva, and this one I don't see a bee larva in it. When the bee is done with that nest, they put a big wall of leaves and seal it off and never come back. These then will develop through the remaining part of the summer. Over the winter, they go into diapause, so they kind of go in suspended animation. Then next summer, they will complete their development and come out and do it again into another hole. So in the wild, these bees are looking in old dead trees that have beetle burrows in them. They're looking in the sides of your house for little holes from a nail or from any hole that they can find. So a lot of bees nest in cavities like that. That's one of their little nest cells. If you dissect it out of the tunnel, it looks like a little room made of leaves. This is an empty one because this is after the next generation, the baby bee has then chewed its way out to start the process all over again. So, most bees nest in the ground, some bees nest in cavities, and then there's a couple other kinds of bee nests, but we don't have really time to talk about those. Sometimes people ask about male bees though. Males actually don't help with nest construction, they don't help collect pollen and nectar, they don't help with the next generation, they mate, and then they're done. And in fact, they only mate once most of the time because the female bee, after she's mated, she can keep the sperm alive in a little pouch she has and use it when she wants to. So after the bee has mated, the male bee has mated, it just flies around and drinks nectar. They don't have anywhere to sleep. This is the early morning, that male bee was sleeping in the bud of a flower. Some bees will sleep in groups, like a big little bachelor herd. This is in the evening. This is the evening light. These bees are coming to roost on this. This is grass. They bite onto it and kind of lock their jaws there and spend the night with their jaws locked on. And so this is common practice with bees called longhorn bees. You can see they have these long antennas. And so you can see this often on sunflowers, like in August. When it's getting evening, look inside the sunflower, and around that central disc, you can see some of these longhorn bees sleeping on the edges. They're male bees, they don't have stingers, and so you can pet them if you want to. But make sure it's a male. So where do bees live as a review? They don't live in paper mache. Most don't live in big hives. In fact, none of the native North American ones live in big hives like this. Honeybees are from Europe. They were brought over by the Pilgrims. So all of the North American bees nest in other places, most of them in the ground. So what do bees eat? Well, we know they eat honey, right? The same cartoon bears have taught us that they eat honey. And I've already kind of mentioned this. Only the honeybee makes and eats honey. The other 3,999 species in North America do not make honey. Well, what do they eat then? Well, they eat pollen and nectar. As adults, they mostly eat nectar with a little bit of pollen. As larvae, they eat a mixture of pollen and nectar. So there's that pollen cake, and there's the larva on it. So that seems pretty easy. They eat pollen and nectar. But some things that we don't often think about with this dietary preference is that there are different preferences that bees have. Are bees picky eaters, I say. So this is a honeybee, and they are generalists. You'll notice the honeybees on your dandelions, and on your cherry tree, and on all these other flowers in your garden. They don't really care what the flowers. In fact, honeybees are even known to collect pollen from corn, which is wind pollinated, but the honeybee doesn't care. It's pollen, it's going to feed it to its babies. So some bees, like the honeybee, are generalists. There are a lot of bees, though, they're specialists. Oops, push the button too fast. So that we make this play. Use the mouse. This is a video of a bee called a squash bee. So squash bees, as their name indicates, pollinate squash flowers. That's pumpkins and zucchinis and yellow coconut squash and all those things like that. They are specialists, meaning that they will only visit squash flowers. If this bee was to come out in the spring or summer and I didn't have squash in my yard, she would have nothing to eat. She would either go to the neighbor's yards, or if there was no squash anywhere, she wouldn't ever switch to a different flower. She is genetically programmed to only see squash flowers as food. It could be a floral scent thing, it could be a pollen protein thing, but she won't change her mind and feed on a different flower. Now this is a male squash bee that has other things in mind. The female doesn't, actually kicks him away, and finally she leaves. With squash flowers though, they find that, so female bees are the ones that are collecting pollen to feed their babies, and they're good pollinators. And specialists, like the squash bee, are really good pollinators of the plants that they specialize on. Studies have found that male squash bees probably transfer more pollen between the flowers than the females, because their mindset is to look for females. So they go from flower to flower to flower looking for females, and every once in a while they stop and get a drink at the bottom. But they're probably in their messaging. Because the females, you see, if I push play again on this, you can see the female cleans herself right about here. She starts cleaning her tongue and her face, and she starts cleaning her body. So she's cleaning herself off from these stray pollen grains. Males, they don't necessarily clean themselves. And so they're going to be moving that pollen to the other flowers, and you'll get more squash. How do you get squash bees in your yard? Well, you plant squash. And they usually come, which is pretty interesting. A lot of bees can smell their flowers from a mile away or farther. And so I didn't have, when I first moved into my house in Stansbury Park out in Tooele County, I didn't have squash, my neighbors didn't have squash. The first year I planted, the second year, planted squash, and the squash bees showed up. So if you plant them, it's kind of if you build it, they will come. Kind of. Squash bees, though, are ground nesting bees, and they like to nest right around the squash plants. So if you have a garden that you till, if you till really deep, you are going to be tilling up some of those squash bee babies. And so if you till less deep, a shallow tilling, you'll preserve more squash bees for the next generation. The studies though have shown that squash bees are nesting sometimes 18 inches under the ground, and none of our tillers really go 18 inches usually. But it's something to keep in mind, that there are bees nesting in your garden, ground nesting bees, that are really good for your garden. So people often ask me this question when I tell them about all these other bees, do they pollinate? I just showed it, a bee pollinating, so the answer should be yes. But there's some really interesting side facts to this. So honeybees are great pollinators. We use those across the world to pollinate our crops. Most of the honeybees in the US go to the almonds in February, the almonds in California in February, right around Valentine's Day, because honeybees are good pollinators. But studies show that honeybees and native bees don't pollinate in the same kinds of ways. So in some apple orchards, for example, 100 honeybees, and I think this is really 100 if you counted it, 100 honeybees can do the same amount of work as 2 native bees. And so these are mason bees. These sometimes people call these blue orchard bees. Blue orchard bee is a kind of mason bee. They are really good pollinators of orchard crops. They are a native bee that nests in a hole like a leafcutter bee, and they are really good for your flowers. I mean, for your fruit set. Studies in small orchards in New York State, upstate New York, have found that even when you have honeybees in your orchard, native bees are doing the majority of the pollination. And so what the native bees need, though, is some native habitat around your garden area to nest in, and to when the apples aren't blooming, they need other food, other flower resources to feed on. So anyway, yes, they pollinate, and in some cases they're really excellent pollinators. One thing that makes native bees slightly different than honeybees is they can do this thing called buzz pollination. Does anyone know what that flower is? It's a tomato flower, very good. And so tomato flowers are weird because they don't let their pollen out for anybody. And in fact, it's hard to get their pollen out. Honeybees don't know how to do it. It's kind of enclosed inside this kind of capsule. So honeybees mostly ignore tomato flowers. But some of these native bees have a special ability to buzz pollinate. This isn't a tomato flower, this is a tomatillo, so it's related. And this was in my yard out in Toole County. So this bee is going to forage around the flower, and then at the very end, what it does is it can vibrate its body at a certain frequency without flying. And that vibration causes that flower to release its pollen. So let me show you here. So I slow it down here, the buzz pollination part. So right now it's walking around the flower. Now it's buzz pollinating. It's vibrating its abdomen right here, and you see pollen grains starting to fly out from that flower. Bumblebees are famous for this. They're good buzz pollinators, but lots of other native bees are too. And so you get more tomatoes per plant and bigger tomatoes per plant when you have buzz pollinators. You get more blueberries and bigger blueberries when you have buzz pollinators. So there are several crops that do better with native bees. In fact, I've heard of a thing called a sonicator that you can self-pollinate your tomatoes. It's like a giant toothbrush, like an electric toothbrush that vibrates, and you just vibrate your tomato plants and it will kind of do this same thing. But the bees do it better. If you have them in your yard. These again, I just planted my tomatillos and they came. I don't know where they came from, but they are there now. And that's a ground nesting bee. It's not looking. Oh, there it goes again. So that last little question, the statement we want to discuss is, are bees disappearing? And the answer is, kind of frustratingly, I don't know. So there's lots of kinds of bees out there. And so while you're looking at this, because I'll have this slide up for a couple slides, these bees are all put on here to scale with each other, not to scale in their life, but to scale with each other. This is a honeybee. So you can think of how big a honeybee is. You might have seen it, like this thumbnail size. Some bees are way smaller than honeybees. Some bees are way bigger than honeybees. So there's lots of sizes and colors and shapes of bees. And most of the research on if bees are disappearing has been done on these kinds of bees. A lot of research has been done on honeybees. And some research has been done on bumblebees. But even that research is kind of inconclusive. There's about 50 species of bumblebees in the US, and there's about 5 of them that have been shown to be dramatically declining. There's another 5 or so that have been shown to be expanding their range, and the rest of them we just don't have enough data to know. And so when we ask, are bees disappearing, it's kind of a loaded question. So imagine if I said to you, birds are disappearing. You might, hopefully you would ask yourself, I wonder what kind of birds he's talking about. Because there's lots of kinds of birds, right? Am I talking about seagulls? Are seagulls disappearing? Or is it hummingbirds? Or is it woodpeckers? Like, what am I really talking about? And that's the same thing for bees. If we say bees are disappearing, which ones? Is it the ground nesting ones, or is it the specialists, or the generalists, or the twig nesting, or which ones are disappearing? But the reality is, there's not enough research to know if they're disappearing. It's really a hard question to answer. Some of these ground nesting bees can stay underground for 4 years in that diapause, in that suspended animation. They're waiting for the right conditions to come out. So if you do a study 1 year, you come back the next year and you don't see any of these bees, it doesn't necessarily mean that they died there. It could just mean that they're still underground waiting for the whatever conditions they're waiting for. And so there's a lot of research that needs to be done on this. And as I say, we're still trying to find out. So my suggestion to people is, if we want to help save the bees, the first step is to be aware of the diversity of bees. Be aware that there's lots of kinds of bees that aren't necessarily like honeybees. Because as we become aware of these, then we can start making positive steps towards research, but also towards landscaping in a way that can benefit these bees. So I want to show you some of the bee diversity. These are some of my favorites. These are one of the biggest in Utah, carpenter bee, and one of the smallest in Utah. This is the kind of fairy bee. That's a quarter, just so you have it for scale. It's a cool bee. This is, I should say, that's one of the smallest fairy bees. This is the smallest fairy bee. That is as big as George Washington's nose on a quarter. This one lives, it's interesting because it's the smallest bee in North America, probably the smallest in the world. It only comes out when it's over 100 degrees, and it lives in the Mojave and Sonoran deserts. So this one in Utah only lives in St. George, but that is a little bee. It's really cute. So there are lots of kinds of bees. If you are a backyard beekeeper, this might offend you, but let me explain. I didn't say this. I didn't know who said it until on Twitter someone told me it might be a professor in Great Britain. He said, raising honeybees to save pollinators is like raising chickens to help birds. So let me explain. I have backyard chickens, and I like my backyard chickens. They're very important birds, right? They give me eggs. Worldwide, you could probably argue that chickens are one of the most important birds, because a lot of people eat chickens. They're good for us, right? And that is true. Honeybees are also very important livestock, like chickens. And they are semi-domesticated. Honeybees aren't from here. They're here because people brought them over as a kind of a livestock-like animal. They don't live very well on their own. They are feral colonies, but they do better when they have some help. The beekeeper is making sure that they're healthy and feeding them in the wintertime, especially up here where it's cold. And so yes, chickens are important. Yes, honeybees are important. But if I want to see more warblers in my yard or more hummingbirds in my yard, I don't necessarily want to buy more chickens, because that's really not going to do anything to bring the hummingbirds to my yard. And if I buy too many chickens, it might actually push out some of those birds, right? Because there's competition there. What are the other birds going to eat? It's the same thing with honeybees. In one of those honeybee boxes that you bought, that you see on the side of the road, the white ones, there's about 50,000 bees in there. And so if you put one of those in your yard, you now need to feed 50,000 bees. And that's okay if you have flowers around. But you need to be aware. It's not up there. We need to be aware that these bees are getting some of the same resources as our wild bees. So there's Morgan Freeman is an actor, and he heard about the plight of bees. He has a ranch in Mississippi, a 30-acre ranch, and he decided he was going to convert it to a bee sanctuary. So he bought 30 beehives and hired some beekeepers and planted lavender and clover in his ranch to feed the bees, and so he was saving the bees. But what he probably didn't realize is that Mississippi has wild bees there. And now when he brought, let's see, 30 hives times 50,000 is a lot. I don't know how much it is. Lots of zeros on it. So he just added a bunch of additional bees to his ranch landscape. And he planted food that the honeybees like, lavender and clover. But what about all those native bees? Those ground nesting bees that he just plowed over and planted clover on? Or what about the specialist bees that don't like clover or lavender? And so sometimes we can be trying our best to save the bees, but without knowing that this isn't maybe the bee that needs to be saved. A lot of people have been saying recently, honeybees are not wildlife. And that's true, they're not wildlife. And so when we want to protect the bees, we should be protecting the wildlife bees, not necessarily the agricultural bees. There's no campaign to save cows out on the ranch. Cows are important in every life, but so we just need to be aware of that. And a part of that is there's some push right now in Utah for some commercial beekeepers to be able to put a lot of their hives out in Forest Service land. Down in southeastern Utah, I think it is. It's in the LaSalle. I read about this. LaSalle, that's something. And so there's some pushback from bee researchers because he wants to put thousands of hives out there. But there's no regulations in place to help to mitigate that, how that might affect the native bees. And so we just need to be aware. Or if you're a backyard beekeeper, there's lots of fun to be had, but just be aware that you need to have flowers that can support your bees and your native bees. So that's enough. I'll get off my soapbox. There you go. How do we bring bees to our yard? Well, bees, like other animals, they need two things: food and habitat. And so it's pretty easy with bees. You need to plant flowers for bees. Now, I'm not saying you need to convert your front yard to this. This was Olivia's mom's yard out in the southern part of Salt Lake Valley. You just need to plant some flowers. If you have one spot for a flower, plant one flower, and that flower can probably help those bees. So the more diversity of flowers you can plant in your yard, the more diversity of bees you can support. When I say diversity of flowers, different sizes and shapes and colors. You know, some flowers are kind of sunflower shaped, some flowers are kind of tubular shaped. Different bees like different kinds of flowers. Different bees like different colors of flowers. You want flowers that bloom in the spring for the springtime bees, and flowers that bloom in the summer for the summer bees. And so diversity of flowers is good because then you have flowers all year, and it looks pretty, but it's also good for the bees. So it can be as simple as that, plant some flowers, but not all flowers are equally attractive to bees. So I have a little quiz. Two sunflowers, which one do you think is better? Which one do you think bees prefer? The one on the right, this right, or the one on the left? Which ones do bees prefer? Left. You're correct. So this is a native sunflower. This is a hybrid sunflower that they grow for, this is the kind, if you go to Trader Joe's and you buy the bouquet, this is often the kind they have. They look really pretty. One of the main differences is this has lots of ray petals, like multiple layers of ray petals. This has one row of ray petals. This is also, I think, often called a pollenless sunflower because it's a hybrid and they bred it to not have as much pollen. Studies have been done when they planted sunflowers with pollen next to sunflowers without pollen, and as you might guess, the bees like the ones with pollen. So yes, you can often tell native flowers are going to be best for native bees because they evolved together. But often the simpler flowers, the less hybridized flowers are going to be more attractive, even if they're not native. But I do suggest native if possible. How about these two roses? Which one do you think is best for bees? Right. Clear, right? This is a wild rose. This is a non-wild rose, cultivated rose. I have actually never seen a bee on one of these roses. They do look really pretty, but I've never seen a bee visiting them. There are lots of kinds of bees that will cover these wild roses. So I'm not saying don't have rose bushes, but be aware that if you want to plant rose bushes, that's not also helping the bees. So we need to keep things in mind like this. I'm doing a study currently, and gathering some data on this last summer and the summer before, about milkweed. So you've probably heard about milkweed. Plant milkweed for monarchs. Monarchs, their larvae only eat milkweed flowers. And so monarchs are in steep decline across the country. And as a way to kind of try to help slow that decline, people across the country are planting milkweed to support monarchs. My question was, if we plant milkweed, what does it do for the bees? What bees visit milkweed? And I'm still investigating this question, but this summer in some of my research, this was some milkweed out in the West Desert of Utah, and I see 3 different kinds of bees here. We have this bee right here, and then 2 longhorn bees. These are 2 different species of longhorn bees, and I haven't quite identified them yet, but I can tell they're different because there's some slight differences in their shape and their color. So on this one milkweed flower, there's 3 different kinds of bees. So it's kind of neat to think that, hey, we can be helping the monarchs by planting the milkweed, and it also seems to support a fairly diverse bee community. So that's kind of neat. So when we're planting our flowers, we can kind of do this, keep this in mind. There's other flowers that will attract hummingbirds, and that's pretty fun to have in there too. So in addition to flowers, though, bees need a place to nest. And a lot of bees don't fly very far from where they're foraging. So for ground nesting bees, we need to provide a ground nesting habitat. And that means we need to leave some ground. Bees like to nest in bare dirt, usually in a sunny spot, not very watered, like if you have sprinkler hitting it all the time, the bees don't usually like that. So between my flowers, I have avoided putting ground cloth or thick layers of mulch, and I leave some bare dirt. Now, not everybody can do this, right? In bare dirt, you often also get weeds. And so, but keep in mind that if you can put some bare dirt somewhere in your yard, even if it's in the back corner, you will probably get bees nesting there. These 2 bees are nesting right here in my bare dirt. So leaving dirt for bees is a good idea. And again, it's hard to kind of incorporate into your landscape, but if you keep it in mind, you can probably find a way. Maybe a simpler way is to provide nesting habitat for these twig nesting bees, these cavity nesting bees. So making a bee block or a bee nest box. I call these bee hotels because I think it sounds cooler, and my kids like it. So these aren't my bee hotels. This one is mine, this one's from the internet. There's lots of ways to make a bee hotel. This is a block of wood. It was a fence post, and I drilled a bunch of holes in it, and then I walked away. And bees came and found it and nested in it. So that's one way you can do it if you're lazy like me. Yes?
Do you have a recommended size, or do you do different sizes?
So different sizes attract different kinds of bees, and there's lots of instructions online. I think these ones are a 1/4 inch. I think 3/4 inch is the bigger bees. Various sizes would be good. Up here you have a kind of different diversity of bees than I do out in the West Desert. And so up here you get more of the metallic blue and green ones that will nest in these. You can buy these at Costco even nowadays, but not every bee nest box is. You can buy it here in Swan. So not every one is equally good. Sometimes these will have all one size, sometimes they'll have multiple sizes. So again, multiple sizes will provide habitat for multiple kinds of bees. Yes?
Does it have to be a depth?
So the depth does make a difference. So some people get really picky about this, and I should say as a hotel owner, a bee hotel owner, I'm more of a bee hospital owner. Maybe they get a little more hands off, because some people will take out these nests every winter and they'll like open them up to make sure the bees are in there, and they'll put them in their shed or in their garage and kind of baby them a little bit. I'm more of I don't do anything. I just leave them out there all winter. But if they're too shallow, then the female bees, I remember I mentioned they can store the sperm. They can actually choose if they're going to lay a boy or a girl egg. And so if it's too shallow, they only lay boys. And that's not as good for the next generation because there's no girl. So they need to be about 6 to 8 inches is the ideal. But in nature, the bees don't really get to choose. They find an abandoned beetle burrow and they make use of it how they can. But so if you are making your own, the easiest way I have found to make my own is I take a bunch of reeds and I cut them to be about 6 to 8 inches long, maybe 10 inches, and then I bundle them together. Here's a leafcutter bee nesting on a reed bee hotel. Here's a backed off view of that. So this is a completed nest that has leaf bits over it. There's a leafcutter bee. And then this is called a grass-carrying wasp. So as a biologist, I do like bees a lot, as you might guess. But I also like wasps, and I like the whole all of nature happening in front of me. The grass-carrying wasp is a specialist hunter of tree crickets. They look kind of like little katydids. So it hunts tree crickets, it stings them and paralyzes them. It shoves them down one of these holes, and it's called the grass-carrying wasp because it will clip pieces of long grass and shove it into the hole on that tree cricket that has paralyzed and laid an egg on. And so I thought it was really cool to see the grass-carrying wasp and the bee nesting in the same place. There's a little video here, or I'll make that one play, on the left. So I was watching this video. I use Phragmites. Phragmites is an invasive reed that we don't like, but I cut it down, and especially at the base of the Phragmites, you can get some big diameters of hollow stems. And so I just bundled that all together. I put a little board over it so if it rains, it doesn't run down into there. And if you put your bee hotel facing southeast, it gets the morning sun, and the bees like that. Some people say, well, it's too hot in the southeast, but it's not. They are adapted to this hot areas. So this bee is looking for its nest. Some people will paint stripes or different things on their nest entry, on their bee hotel entrance to try to assist the bees in finding their house. I don't know if that works or not. But it's kind of fun. And so these are really mellow bees too. I mean, I can stand, well, I don't know how close I am in this video, but probably less than a foot away, and they don't care. My kids will go up there and watch it. It's just kind of a fun thing to have in your yard. Also, it can provide habitat for these bees. Something to keep in mind though, if you are going to make a bee hotel or buy a bee hotel, I leave mine for multiple years out, like this, going backwards now. This one has been for a lot of years, and I noticed this last summer I had quite a few parasitic wasps. Because what you're doing is you're concentrating the bees, and then as soon as a parasite gets there, it has lots of potential hosts. And so if you leave it in the same spot, you can concentrate these parasites, which isn't necessarily good for the bees. As an ecologist, I like to watch the parasites too, but you can do that by changing out the reeds or getting a different hotel every couple of years, or moving it to a different spot. There's various ways you can do that. But so be aware that you probably shouldn't be as hands-off as I am. But there's lots of instructions online there too. Any questions about those bee hotels? Yes.
So, I guess I have two questions about the cavity bees.
Yeah.
One which you said that if the cavities are shallow, they only lay males.
Yes.
So, if it's deep, are they gonna lay females in the first few and then males at the shots?
They actually lay the females at the back and
Yeah,
the
it's
males
good.
in the front.
That's
So then the males come out first,
Right.
and then they disperse, and then the females come out about a week later. The females they give more pollen to, so they're a little bit bigger, so that kind of slows the development. And so yeah, so they do timing. So the males, so yeah, the males come out first, and the females come out after that. Does that answer that?
Yeah.
What was the
I
second
forgot my second question.
Yes.
Okay, so is it instinct just to lay the male at a certain spot then?
It's probably at a certain depth from the entrance. They probably say, "Oh, this is good for a male," but I'm not sure. I'm anthropomorphizing the bees, and they're not really thinking, "Should I lay a male?" But yeah, there's some instinct that says this depth would be good for a male.
But it seems like you said, there was males and females in the same spot. So is it almost as though they're just doing it anyway, without it's just instinct? As soon as I get to this depth, no matter what, whether I'm laying a female or not, I'm just going to be there anyway.
I'm not sure. So, and the problem is there's not a lot of studies on that. There are some studies that show the shallower ones have the males. But again, in nature, so as an ecologist, I think in nature they don't get to choose the depth of their nest. They're going to utilize whatever they find. And so I don't think it's 100% of the time if it's less than 3 inches as a male. It wouldn't make sense to me for that to evolve that way. But so I'm not sure. I don't know the answer.
For the ground nesting bees, do you have a minimum recommended size of air patch?
No, the ground nesting bees, there's such a diversity of what they prefer. Those ones with the chimneys, like really hard packed dirt, like dirt roads. There's some that only nest in sand, and some that will nest in your lawn. Some that like leaf litter to nest under. So I think that anything you can do will be a good start. I thought about just taking like a bag of dirt, like sandy dirt, and dumping it in a pile to see what happens. But I have seen them nesting in like a small spot on my grass guide, and it was just dirt, and there was bees nesting. So I don't think that they're the ones that you will first get in your yard are pretty flexible, and so they'll nest just about anywhere. So there are not a lot of studies on how to encourage the ground nesting bees, other than we know they nest in the ground.
I remember my second question. So you said earlier that in harsh conditions, some of these bees, cavity nesting bees, would go into diapause.
Yeah, I was specifically talking about ground nesting.
Ground nesting.
I'm not sure if cavity do or not.
Okay, so that's basically, I was wondering if you were gonna rotate out some of these tubes, would you want to wait a couple of years in case there was
I don't think so. The way that someone actually found out that the bees will wait like 4 to 7 years underground is there was a grad student that dug up some bees, and they didn't come out the next spring. And as grad students sometimes do, he had it in an aquarium on his desk and just left them there, didn't clean out what he thought were dead bees. And then I think it was 7 years later, there was bees flying around in his aquarium. Holy cow. They were alive, they weren't dead. And so that's how we know. With this, I'm not sure. I know that people do, some of the bigger organizations will try to manipulate when they come out by putting them in giant fridges and giant freezers and then warming them up. That's how they've tried to get some of these native bees to pollinate the almonds in California. But that's a lot of work to do, even though they're better pollinators. But you have to refrigerate them and trick them into thinking it's spring. Let me keep going here a little bit. I want to talk about bee diversity, and then we'll have more time for questions. Sorry, I should have asked you to ask questions in a minute. Everything east of the Mississippi River, including in Canada, studies show there's about 750 bee species. It's pretty good. Utah has about 1,100. We say about because we don't know exactly. Every time we go out and do studies, we find different things that we didn't know were here. So, but even in Utah, bee diversity is not equally distributed across the state. So, for example, down in the Grand Staircase National Monument, that little yellow spot right there, we found 660 bee species. So that means the Grand Staircase has almost as many bee species as the entire eastern U.S. So Utah is a hotspot of bee diversity. Grand Staircase is a hotspot within a hotspot of bee diversity. And as I was talking earlier before we started, the Bears Ears area is probably equally or more diverse. And we have Zion National Park area, which probably is likely pretty diverse because it has Great Basin influences, Mojave influences, and other stuff. So Utah is a pretty neat place. We are the beehive state, but not because of honeybees, because we have a lot of kinds of bees in our hive, a lot of diversity. of these grand staircase bees, of the 660 species. So we finished this study in 2002, but we just published it last year, 2 years ago. We found 49 new species. So these are species new to science. Nobody knew about them before our study. And then we found what we call morpho species, 150 of the species that we collected. We're not sure what they are. They don't fit any of the known species, but they're also not quite distinct enough to be called new species, or people haven't had enough time to look thoroughly at them. So there's a lot of unknown, really cool stuff in Utah. The difficulty is there's time and funding and effort to describe these and to figure out what's going on. It takes a lot of work. This was a 4-year study down there. 10 field technicians every week, 5 days a week for 4 years of summers. It takes a lot of work. And then several years after that, identifying and trying to write the paper and everything. So Utah is a pretty interesting place. This is my last little bit. This is my call to action. Sort of. We are in this hotspot of bee diversity. We have a lot to be proud of as a beehive state. And if we are to be aware of the bee diversity, we can do things to help protect these bees in Utah. We have a lot of public land that houses a lot of bees. We have a lot of private land that houses these bees. And so there's a study that just came out this week from down by Las Vegas that shows, there's those big solar arrays going out by Las Vegas. They did some analyses to show where this certain kind of bee lives. Then they looked at the changes from solar arrays and the changes from the urbanization of growing the urban sprawl. That's the word I'm looking for. And so the solar arrays were not harming the best bee habitat as much as the urbanization was harming the best bee habitat. So one of the biggest threats to native bees is habitat changes. And that can be from solar arrays, that can be from changing a field into an agricultural area. But so Utah has a lot of great areas for bees, and if we can be aware of that, I think there's a lot of opportunity for land managers, for example, to teach people about these native bees, because we are this hot spot. And maybe there's a spot where these chimney bees are nesting by moths. Actually, I know the spot right now. We could put a sign there and show people these chimney bees, and that would be cool. So there's a lot of things we can do, and we need to start by just being aware of it. So thank you for coming and listening and participating. There is that social media I promised I would show you. And we have time for questions?
We do have time for questions. Before we do questions, though, I'm just going to really quickly mention that on February 22nd, we are hosting a bee house making workshop. So if you would like to come and make your own bee house, it's in partnership with the Hollow Tree Honey Foundation, and that's from 12 to 3 on the 22nd. And there are 3 time slots you can sign up for. So we ask that you register. The registration link is on our website. But that's coming up. And then there's also another lecture on February 13th about revisiting the West.
Oh, that's
So
awesome.
guys, clear for that. And now we're open for questions.
Oh,
Oh, yeah, there's your plan.
I bet it's
You just press on, I think.
30 on. If you do make a bee house and you put it out in the spring, and if there's no bees at first, just wait. Because sometimes you have to be patient and they'll find. Yes.
Are there also ground wasps? I have some probably bees because they don't bother anybody, but they're near a trampoline.
So, wasps are like bees in that most of them are solitary ground nesting wasps. And the solitary ones are less aggressive, these are the wasps, than the social wasps. So there are tons of wasps that nest in the ground. Playground sand, or like a beach volleyball court, there's lots of wasps that will nest in there. A lot of times they're called sand wasps. They hunt flies, and so they can sting you if you grab them, but they, like the ground nesting bees, are pretty mellow unless you think they're going to get squished. So it's hard to tell if they're bees or wasps just from a first observation. There are also some kinds of yellow jackets that nest in the ground, and they have a big hive under there, and they are really aggressive. Those are the ones that when you're mowing your lawn and they come and attack you, those are the yellow jackets. There was a question over here.
Yeah, you have a lot of cool pictures from your backyard. Do you just spend an inordinate amount of time there? Or are there certain times you would go that you can see, you're more likely to see bees?
So when we first moved in our house 7 years ago, it was designed to look like a golf course. And I don't golf, so that means it was mostly grass. And then there was some ivy surrounding the grass. And so my wife started studying bees before me. And so we wanted to change that. And so we have slowly, over these 7 years, been doing stuff. And then this year, we're going to have to rip out more to do more stuff because it got overgrown. But I think that the best, so Utah, from our studies in grand staircase, Utah has 2 peak times of bee diversity. Up here, it might be different. But in the valleys of Utah, you have a peak right around the end of May, starting in June, when there's lots of bees out. July is really not that diverse of a bee time for Utah. There's not a lot of native wildflowers in the valleys in July. And then you get another peak when you get kind of those summer rains that come in August, mid-August and September. So those are the 2 peak times for bee diversity. In my yard, I have the best job in the world. I'm a professor, and so I don't teach in the summer. And so I play in my yard, and I run around the deserts and take pictures of bees for work. So it's pretty awesome. Yes, over here, we'll go back there.
So the rural lights that affect honeybees, do they also affect?
They do not. They are specific on, so the question was, the varroa mites that attack honeybees affect native bees, and they don't. They're specific on native bees. And one of the problems with varroa mites and honeybees is they'll go from colony to colony, as especially the male honeybees go in, they get lost and go into whatever colony they see, and they'll spread the mites around. So there are parasites on native bees, but they don't have the same huge consequences, because since they're solitary, it's kind of like if you're sick and you come to an activity like this and cough on everybody, you're going to spread it. But if you're sick and you stay home, then it just affects you. And so that's the solitary versus the social aspect. But yeah, the mites don't. There are some internal parasites that seem to be transferable between honeybees and bumblebees, for example, but a lot of the native bees don't seem to be affected by the same parasites. Yeah.
What are yellow jackets?
Yellow jackets are a kind of wasp. Hornets are a kind of wasp. So wasp is a big category, and if you look at it evolutionarily, it includes ants and bees. So bees are actually just an herbivorous kind of wasp that evolved to be a pollinator, evolutionarily. So wasp would be the big category like mammal, maybe, and then you can subdivide mammals into the hornet kind of wasps and the bee kind of wasps. So yellow jackets are a social relative of hornets, but they are a wasp. There was a question back there.
So you mentioned how little data that you have on multiple species of bees. Are there any citizen science projects that you've helped out?
So we've been talking a lot about that. We were in a meeting yesterday with Utah Rare Plants, plants and insects. But and there's various Utah citizen science groups. What's the Utah citizen science website? Remember what it is? Utah Citizen Science.
Yeah, I think it's something like that.
So the challenge with the citizen science with bees, because people across the country have tried to do some things, the challenge is with 4,000 species in the U.S., it's hard to get good, reliable data that is informative to the questions about bees declining. There are some that are focused on bumblebees that are encouraging people to take pictures of the bumblebees and upload them to various apps. iNaturalist is one that I really like, but it's not the citizen science driven one, but then people will identify the pictures. What are the bumblebee ones? The apps for the citizen science. I mean, not the websites.
Bumblebee Watch.
Bumblebee Watch, that's the one. So there are some, but the challenge is there's hardly any resources for people to identify bees. Me and Olivia are currently working on field guides, but even then, I don't have all 4,000 species in the field guide. And so, birds, there's a lot of citizen science things with birds. That's a little bit easier, but even if you're a birder, you might know the term LBJ, little brown jobby. You see a little sparrow-looking thing, and then it flies away, and it could be one of 30 species. And so that's just like that with bees times 300.
Can I just add to that?
Yes.
If you have iNaturalist, take pictures of bees and just upload them, because that helps. And as soon as they get identified by anybody, and then it counts as research grade observations, we draw from iNaturalist data all the time,
Yeah.
so it is valuable.
I was going to say that I'm currently working on a project with bumblebees. So bumblebees in the Intermountain West, a lot of them have red on them, like they're yellow and black with a red stripe. In California, a lot of them are yellow, but they're mostly black, like the body's mostly black. In the East Coast, they're half black, half yellow. And so we have these different distinct patterns. And so I've been using these online databases like iNaturalist, when people will be hiking and they'll see a bumblebee, they take a picture, and their phone automatically tags it with the location. So I've been able to start mapping where these color patterns are across the U.S. It's like mimicry patterns, so it's beneficial to have red if you live in the Intermountain West, because the birds know that red, yellow, and black are bad. So iNaturalist is one that I think does a really good job because there's this bee researcher that is somehow amazing at identifying pictures of bees online, and he's looked at tens of thousands of them, and he frequents iNaturalist. So if you take pictures of bees and upload it, they will likely get identified. And I don't mind if you email or tag me in some of these things, and I can try to identify things. Often it's just to the genus level what we can do with pictures. But anyway, that kind of was a long answer that we don't really have any citizen science questions.
Also, you don't know how to use iNaturalist, we'll be doing some lessons on it in
Oh, awesome.
April as well, so if you want to learn.
And it's not just for bees, it's plants.
Yeah, you can do it with everything, but if you're like, what is iNaturalist, how do I use that?
So I saw a bunch of
Sorry.
things come up. I'm gonna go here and I'll get some of you guys over there.
What would you expect the surrounding species that you find in alpine bed and environmental water, or would you
That's a good question. So up higher elevations, you get more bumblebees than we do in the valleys. There's something like 20 different bumblebee species in Utah. Some of these are really in steep decline. There's one called the western bumblebee, it's Bombus occidentalis, that we potentially have some stable populations in Utah. I hesitate because we don't really know the status of them. But so you get lots of kinds of bumblebees up here, but also these mason bees, the metallic bluish, greenish ones. It's a higher diversity in the mountains than there are in the valleys. And so bumblebees and mason bees will be pretty commonly encountered up here. As you get higher up, it seems like you get more cavity nesting bees, but that's not necessarily always true. But there are bees. I've been up in the Uintas at 12,000 feet above tree line, and there's bees, bumblebees and others. There was a question back there, and then I'll come up.
I wanted to ask a little bit about, you talk about habitat and things. How effective are the bees, native and otherwise, by the pesticides that are used and the fertilizers that?
That is a very complicated question. There's lots of studies being done. Most of the studies are done on honeybees because they're a little bit easier to manage and maintain. And most of those studies show a negative effect of pesticides, as you might expect. But even then, there's some nuance there. For example, there was a study that was replicated. It was Germany, United Kingdom, and France using neonicotinoid pesticides. That's one we hear about being really bad. The United Kingdom one found a really negative effect of neonicotinoid exposure on honeybees. The one in France found it was kind of neutral. It was unclear if it was a negative effect or not. The one in Germany showed no effect of the neonicotinoids. So these were all on honeybees, and those differences show that it's not uniformly bad across everything. There's studies on herbicides that show they don't necessarily kill bees, but they might confuse them so they can't find their way back to their nest. Same with some fungicides. But the real challenge here is that what's bad for a honeybee or what's good for a honeybee might not be equally bad or good for a ground nesting bee. For example, with pesticide exposure, the best practices for honeybees is you spray when honeybees are not out, either in the evening or some other time, or you can close the honeybee boxes. And then honeybees can come the day after and forage to be fine. The problem is that pesticide the application goes on the plants and then the residue goes down onto the ground. If the ground nesting bees are nesting in the ground, we don't know how that kind of residual exposure affects them. Or also, the honeybees are going to be gathering nectar and pollen from various resources throughout the life of the hive, which is multiple years. A solitary bee gathers one big mass of pollen and deposits that. And so if that pollen has more pesticide exposure, it might affect it in a greater way than it might affect honeybees. And so the answer is we don't know, but there's not an easy answer to it. I mean, because organic pesticides, like the nicotine-based pesticides that are labeled organic, those are probably still bad for bees. And so I'm not sure what the best answer is, but someone might have more to say or give us a question.
Well, actually, I'm going back to years ago when they were talking about killer bees coming in.
Yeah.
And how are those affecting the ground nesting versus?
So that's a good question. So killer bees is one that we've heard about in the news a lot. It seems like we heard a little more about it in the 90s, and we kind of shifted our focus to other things. So killer bees are a race of honeybees. So they're European honeybees that have been bred with an African strain of honeybees to be harder workers. This was a project done in Brazil, and then they escaped. And they are harder workers. So it worked, but they're also more aggressive. And they've been moving their way north. And they call them killer bees because it sounds really scary, but they're not necessarily, they're not more toxic than honeybees, they're just more aggressive than the European variety of honeybees. So normal honeybees will send workers out to sting you, killer bees will send more workers out to sting you. I had a friend who studied honeybees in California for his master's and PhD, and he said his hives were Africanized, is the term, they were killer bees, and he still got honey from them, and he still studied them, and you can still work with them, and they do a really good job of pollination. You just have to, is anyone a beekeeper here? And so if you have your hive, if you approach your hive, you kind of can tell the mood of the bees, and so you know when they're kind of in a bad mood and you would like act differently. Or you kind of get to know the different hives and you can know how to act around them. And it's the same with killer bees, but you have to be a lot more timid around them or patient around them. Because they're more aggressive, they can't withstand the cold winters. They don't huddle as tightly, and they probably won't come far north than St. George Canal area, and they are in St. George Canal. The effect of some of these feral bees, like the killer bees, there was a study a couple of years ago from St. George. There was one of those small fairy bees that was pollinating an endangered poppy. It was a specialist on the poppy, and it hasn't been found in St. George for 20 years. They think it was because these feral Africanized honeybees had outcompeted it. They drain the flower of its resources before the fairy bee comes out. So they can have a negative effect, and they are mean, but they're not like a huge danger to our world. There was a bunch of questions, and I put them off.
I think we probably have time for 2 more questions.
2 more. I said your hand has been up lots of times, so right.
How intentionally aggressive are wasps towards bees?
There are some bees that specifically, some wasps that specifically hunt bees, and so those ones are very aggressive towards them, but they're a solitary wasp, so they don't make a huge dent in the bee population. Most of the time they don't bother each other very much, but even some of these social wasps, sometimes, especially up here in the higher elevations, some of the yellow jackets will kind of invade a honeybee hive. Have you guys had any problems with yellow jackets in your hive? And it's usually in the late summer, early fall, and because the wasps are social too, and they're trying to get their next generation ready, and so they'll invade the honeybee hives both for the brood, and they probably eat the honey too, I would assume. And so yeah, they can be a problem.
So they're eating the bees?
Yeah, they're eating the baby bees. I don't know if they eat the adults, but they definitely kill the adults. Have you had any? What's your experience?
It's usually there's a weakness. If I've had something wrong with the hive, and they find a way in, a vulnerability, then.
So if you have a healthy hive, usually it's all right.
Yeah, they can fend them off.
So we have one more question. Do we have 2 more questions? I saw these 2, but I'll go right first.
I was just wondering, we had a yellow jacket hive it was actually on our deck, and they never bothered us at all. But do they help with pollinating well enough to be?
Well, that's a good question.
Useful?
Yes, so our wasp pollinators generally. So I split my pollination idea into 2 categories. I call them purposeful pollinators, because it has the and it sounds good. Purposeful pollinators and accidental pollinators. The purposeful pollinators, they don't care about the flowers, but they are on purpose manipulating pollen. In their case, they're getting it to feed their babies. That's the bees, right? They're gathering pollen, so they're actively manipulating the pollen. They're going to be really good at moving pollen because they're trying to move it. Then there's the accidental pollinators, and that's anything that visits the flower and then accidentally gets them on its face. Hummingbirds are accidental pollinators. They're not trying to manipulate the pollen. The plants have evolved ways to kind of trick them into getting some on their forehead. So hummingbirds, wasps, and butterflies are these accidental pollinators. Wasps do visit flowers for nectar, and so they can get, and flies too, and they can get pollen on them and move it. Some flowers have specifically evolved to rely on these accidental pollinators, so some flowers are fly pollinated. Chocolate, I think, is fly pollinated. I mean, the cocoa beans, chocolate's not a flower. The cocoa beans are. So yeah, some flowers are exclusively pollinated by flies, but I still claim that bees are better pollinators because they're purposeful. But yes, wasps can be pollinators too, just like butterflies can.
Breeding programs for bees, are there any?
Breeding programs for the native bees?
Yeah.
There's some work being done on some leafcutter bees, some work being done on some mason bees. So you can actually order mason bees and leafcutter bees online. I have some reservations about that because I don't want people to buy. Some people will trap the bees up in Washington State and sell elsewhere, and I don't think that's necessarily good for the bees because they are locally adapted to different places. My preference is for people to make habitat and encourage their native fauna to grow, but people do use leafcutter bees and mason bees for crop pollination, and so there is some commercialized breeding programs. And sometimes they're breeding programs, sometimes they're trapping programs, and there's a difference there in my mind. But so there is some. Since most bees are ground nesting bees, though, they're still not a good way to
Domesticate.
Yeah, to domesticate or even like move. Yeah. I think that's it. And Four more minutes.
When you were talking about, you mentioned that yellow jackets are aggressive.
Yes.
We had years ago, we had a beagle that got swarmed and he was fine. But what are the ones to really watch out for? I mean, is it yellow jackets?
So the ones that I avoid the very most in my yard, I'm going to move forward on this in so I can show pictures, are yellow jackets and paper wasps. Both yellow jackets and paper wasps, we have native yellow jackets and native paper wasps. The ones that we mostly have a problem with in our yards are these introduced yellow jackets and paper wasps. European yellow jacket, European paper wasp. These are the most common ones you have in your yard with the little honeycombs up in your corners under your deck. This is a European paper wasp, and it kind of pushes out the native paper wasps. Its hive, this colony will have 100 workers. The native ones will have a dozen or so. They're bigger, but these are more aggressive and alpha. There is a European yellow jacket that also is really common in our more urban environments. Both of them are very aggressive. And they're aggressive for two reasons. One, they're wasps, so they're more aggressive. But they also have a hive, a colony to protect. So these ones, if you've watched them on those little honeycombs, and you look at them, and they look at you, and you move around like this, and they move around like this, and if you get too close, or you stick your tongue out of them, or whatever, they'll see you. They kind of fly down and up and find a spot to get to. Yellow jackets do the same thing. My dad got stung by a yellow jacket in his yard down in Lehigh, and I wanted to come see where it was and try to take care of it. And I was looking at it, it was probably this far away, and I was looking, and one flew and stuck my hand. They just do that. So, and I don't know a good way to control them, because that's the next question. Yes?
Yeah, I was just wondering if you have resources that you recommend locally, especially for creating your habitats.
So in my book, in my book,
In the gift shop. In the gift shop, you can buy it after.
in the gift shop, I'll sign it for you. Chapter 2 is how do we attract bees to a yard. We do have some plant lists. This is for all of North America. So we've split up North America into like 7 regions. And so we have some plants that are better for bees. And I'm somewhat embarrassed about it because they're not all native plants, but I did this because I wanted to reach a broad audience and a lot of people don't have access to native plants. The USU extension, I think, has various lists online. But there's more and more and more lists available if you just Google good bee plants for Utah or good bee plants for the West. Even as nurseries are starting to label things bee plants, but as we were discussing in a meeting the other day, we're not sure who decides if it's a good bee plant. For my book, it's just me and Olivia, from just kind of our experience when we see stuff on. But not all good bee plants are equal. Russian sage, people often use for a good bee plant. I have it in my book and I have it in my yard. I see tons of honeybees and a few bumblebees on it. Sunflowers, I see tons of other kinds of bees. And so, there's not an easy answer, but there's lots of resources online. In the book. Do we have any minutes left?
Yeah, you got 2 minutes.
I'm going to go there first, so you can ask a question.
I'm not sure I heard if they have lifespans long enough they migrate.
Oh, they do not migrate. In fact, their lifespan is surprisingly short as adults. Usually as an adult, it'll be 3 to 6 weeks above ground flying around doing their work. The rest of their year-long life is underground as a larva, looks like a maggot. So it's pretty short, so none of them do migrate. There are very few that are social. There's some exceptions, but yeah, none of them migrate. They're all pretty short-lived. I'm good?
Go if you can ask that, you can answer.
One more.
How do bees collect and transport nectar?
How do they transport the nectar? That's a good question. They drink it into a crop. Some people call it a honey stomach, but it's a crop like a bird would have a crop like a pouch before the stomach. and then they bring it back and spit it out.
But how do they actually, I know butterflies have a proboscis so that you can see
Yeah.
what they're feeding. What, do these have a tongue or what?
They do have a tongue. People call the whole mouth assembly, they call it a proboscis, but it's not a tube like a butterfly's. The tongue is made of like 4 or 5 parts that are pretty diagnostic for identification, which is annoying if you're trying to identify a bee because you have to look under its face for the tongue. But it has kind of these 2 parts that surround, almost like a tunnel, surround the main tongue, and the tongue has lots of little hairs on it. So it's almost like the way a cat drinks with the hairs that stick, the liquid sticks to it, plus they have that thing that surrounds it, and have 2 little appendages that can help manipulating there. But yeah, so they do have a tongue that helps them. In fact, there's one kind of bee, the one that looks like the wasp that I showed you, the branched hairs on its shoulder. That one doesn't have a way to carry pollen either. So it carries the pollen and the nectar in its crop, and then regurgitates them at the nest like a bird would do.
I think that's it.